Hello, my good friends. Here we are again. Um, this is week 3 of our new online lives, and I'm sipping some hot tea, and I don't know what else to say. I hope everybody's doing well. I hope you're feeling comfortable. I hope you are not gathering in large crowds. I hope you're not sick. Since the last time I checked in with you all, I know of 2 more people that have gotten sick. So shit is real. So today we're talking about this book right here, Palaces for the People. And the subtitle is How Social Infrastructure Can Help Fight Inequality, Polarization, and the Decline of Civic Life. It's by Eric Klinenberg, who's a sociologist at New York University from Chicago. And so you may have picked that up in the intro. So I have not taught this book before. I just put these slides together a few minutes ago. I finished working on them. Um, so this will, we'll see. We'll work through this. We'll work through this together. I wanted us to read from this book because I'd been interested in reading this book. I'd been interested in teaching this book, and the COVID crisis and online world gave me the opportunity to rework the syllabus a little bit and throw in a couple of chapters from this that I thought would be particularly apt for thinking about what coronavirus means for us in the context of community life. So there's lots of stuff to think about here. So Eric Klinenberg starts the book by invoking a case that is a case he's very familiar with. It's a case he wrote his dissertation in his first book about back in the 90s, called, the book was called Heat Wave. And so he starts by talking about the Chicago heat wave of 1995. And many of you are from Chicago and Chicagoland. Probably very few of you were around in 1995, but you have parents, I'm sure, who lived through it. And one of the things that stood out to me from the story that he tells about the Chicago heat wave was that the temperatures were unprecedented, and the temperatures had been heretofore unimaginable, 126 degrees. But it wasn't the temperature that was necessarily the problem. In some ways, the temperature was a catalyst. In some ways, it was a cause. But in some ways, the temperature was a consequence of problems that were really systemic problems. And so the heat wave of Chicago, when the temperature got that high, it stressed the systems to such a point that they began to break down, because it was so radical, such a massive temperature that the systems hadn't been designed to account for that. So he gives us the example of energy. So when it's 126 degrees outside, people are cranking their AC. Well, your AC draws power from the power grid. And when everybody's cranking their AC, and their AC needs to work, not only is it cranked all the way up, but it's got to work a lot harder because it's trying to correct. I mean, imagine how much more energy it takes to bring 126 degrees down to 70 or 65 than it takes to bring 95 degrees down to 70 or 65. It takes a lot more energy. So the electrical grid in Chicago could not handle how much energy it was being asked to produce, and it broke down. It's a system that was designed, and it wasn't designed for that level of stress. And so when systems get stressed in moments of great and unanticipated sort of radical departure from the normal standard range of things. Systems break down. And you might be thinking, well, that sounds familiar. That sounds like something that we're experiencing right now, and it is. So, who was hardest hit during the Chicago heat wave? Well, obviously, the first group of people that were the hardest hit were those who were socially isolated. Sound familiar? So people that lived alone and people that didn't have a lot of close contacts, people whose maybe friends and family lived far away, or who were elderly, and so most of their friends had moved on to greener celestial pastures, aka bucket kicking. Maybe they were estranged from their children, whatever it would be. But it was people who were isolated, who were living alone, who didn't have lots of social capital, lots of social bonds with people around them. And then, of course, the most vulnerable neighborhoods were disproportionately adversely affected, and those tended to be black neighborhoods. Many, but, and this is very important, not all. And so he raises this question. Okay, so you've got neighborhoods in which the demographics are the same. They're 85% African American, and the socioeconomics are the same. Average household income is, I'm just making this up, it's 1995, so let's say $18,000 a year. And so they're equally poor, but what is making the difference between communities that are more resilient in the face of this heat wave and communities that were less resilient, that faced a conflagration of deaths and injuries and that sort of thing? And so what he says is, well, the difference was social capital. But he's not content to just say the difference is social capital and to leave it there. He wants to move on and say the difference wasn't just social capital, but it was the physical built infrastructure that allows for the development of social capital. And that's the difference. That's social infrastructure. That's the reason why he brings in the heat wave and opens the book with that particular anecdote. So then he moves on to talking about, well, what is social capital and why is it declining? This is kind of Putnam's same story, so this shouldn't be unfamiliar with you, but he brings it into a much more contemporary context, because Putnam's book was written in 2000 or published in 2000. This book came out, I think, in 2018, so it's very timely. So he departs from this assumption that we in the United States, residents and citizens and people that live and work and exist in the U.S. are much more isolated, much more siloed, much less connected than we used to be in, I'm just pulling out random decades here, the 1930s, the 1950s, the 1970s, the 2000s. So I get the sense, and I have not ever seen data graphed like this, but I get the sense that if you could measure social capital and you could graph social capital over a long historical period, you would see a downslope throughout the 20th century and beyond of just a sort of steady deterioration of social capital. So, we know why Putnam, the reasons that Putnam highlights, that Putnam pinpoints for the deterioration of social capital: screen time, economic and work pressures, sprawl in the suburbs, racism, etc. Well, Eric Klinenberg has a similar story, but not the same story. And so he highlights 3 things, maybe 4 things. He doesn't actually put them in these terms. These are my terms, but this is what I get out of it. The first of which is segregation. And we know this. We've seen the maps. We've talked about segregation. We've talked about spatial inequality. We've looked at zoning maps and how zoning, separates us out by socioeconomic group, by racial group. And so we understand sociologically we live in segregated places, not fully segregated, not apartheid, not Jim Crow, but if you're walking around your subdivision with 3-car garages on a golf course, you're pretty much going to see, middle-aged and middle class or upper middle class white folks, right? We live in segregated worlds. And so that is part of why our social capital is limited, because we do too much bonding and not enough bridging, to use the language of Robert Putnam. Too much bonding, not enough bridging, because we don't have an infrastructure. We don't have a physical setup. We aren't engineered to be around people that are different from us. It isn't that we wouldn't want to be. We're not naturally, inherently in a tabula rasa, in a state of nature, born saying like, white supremacy is the best ideology. We learned that, and part of how we learned that is because of the physical way that we are laid out, the physical ways in which we are separated from one another, not allowed to interact with one another, not allowed to get to know one another in that sort of meaningful way. Inequality, right? We live in a deeply unequal country, in a deeply unequal time in this country. We live in a place and in a time where the top 1% owns more wealth. The top 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 50%. Okay, so take half of America. What would that be? 170 million people. And then take the top 1%. And those two things, if you put them on a scale, would balance out. So that is an inequality that is so radical, it's never been seen in the world in recorded history. I mean, the Gilded Age was an age of terrible inequality, but it wasn't as bad then as it is now. And so inequality is another thing that gets in the way of the construction of social capital. Because if we are so radically unequal, it creates political instability, Bill McKibben. It creates resentment and rancor. It creates divisions. It creates isolation. And then finally, we're polarized. Polarized like we've never, ever been in our history. Politically polarized, ideologically polarized. I saw a study not too long ago that asked people if they would be accepting if their child married a person of a different political party. And this was a longitudinal survey over a long period of time. And I'm paraphrasing this badly because I don't remember the details of the survey, but let's say 30 years ago, lots of people were like, yeah, of course. Why? I mean, do they love each other? Is he a nice person? Are they a nice person? In which case, whatever, politics, as long as they're a good person, they're going to take care of my kid, and they're going to love each other and be solid people. Who cares, right? That was the attitude many years ago, but that has changed gradually over time. We live in a time that is so polarized that most people today, if you ask them, would you be okay accepting if your child married somebody of a different political party, they say no. They say no. So I mean, we live at a time where we just can't empathize with people on the other side of the political aisle. We think that they're either idiots or we believe that they are genuinely evil human beings. And that's not great. It's not great for having a society, for having a community that comes together, that looks out for each other, that values the collective good over the individual good, that participates in collective action, that participates in a robust democracy, right? When we are segregated, unequal, and polarized AF, that's, you know, text speak for as fuck. Just figured, you know, in case you didn't know that, I want to make sure you knew that. It takes a real toll on our ability to produce social capital. And then the third thing, or the fourth thing, is that he talks about the disappearance of the welfare state. And yeah, the welfare state is gone. It's gone. It's been gone. I don't know why I just went with like southern, like redneck accent on that one, but that's where I went. I don't know why. But the welfare state is gone. What is the welfare state? Sounds terrible. The government's terrible and welfare's terrible. These are evil things. They do terrible things. That's not true. But that's what we've been told. So what is the welfare state? Why is it gone? Why do we care? Well, the idea, and we're a long way from this ideal, but government, democratic government, is supposed to be a thing that acts in the public good, in the greatest, on behalf of the greatest good for the most amount of people. That's the whole reason why the government is supposed to exist. Everything that the government does is supposed to be for the public good, for the greatest good for the most amount of people. That's the whole reason it exists. Speed limits, they're annoying. We break them. They're there because the government put them there with the belief, with the expectation that if we followed them, we'd be more likely to kill ourselves, less likely to kill ourselves and to kill others, and maim as well. Stoplights, they're there for that same reason. The Food and Drug Administration that, you know, periodically checks out the hamburger manufacturing plant to make sure it's, you know, that like rats aren't taking a dump in the food. It's supposed to be there to protect the greatest good. Cash transfer programs that have all been wiped out. Now we have SNAP, food stamps. Those programs are there because they're supposed to act in the public good, right? The subsidies that we give, the millions of dollars that we give every year to farmers so that they can afford to farm, we do that because that's supposed to be in the public good. We're protecting our agricultural sector, which is a heritage sector of our economy. What's another random example? The Army, right? The Army is supposed to keep us safe. It's supposed to act, the armed services, all of the military forces are supposed to act on our behalf, keeping us safe in terms of the public good. Schools, public schools, supposed to educate everybody. Everybody's supposed to have equal access to a good public education, because that's the most important thing that you can have to be sort of upwardly mobile in a democratic society, is equal access to equal education. So public schools, these are, I mean, public schools weren't designed to you know, make people dumber or mean. They weren't designed as bully havens or you know, places to get hooked on hot dogs and shitty frozen pizza. They're designed to build democracy, right? So that's the idea of a state, all right? That's what government is supposed to do. When I say state, I mean government. State equals government for our purposes here. So different states, different governments decide to act in the public good differently according to different ideologies, okay? So All governments are supposed to act in the public good. That's the only thing they're supposed to do. But some governments have decided, according to different ideologies, that different ways of acting are better or worse for the public good. We live in a time in which the government of the United States is what we call a neoliberal state. And a neoliberal state believes that the best way to promote the public good is to, and I'm editorializing here, forgive me, but I'll try to be as neutral as possible in my word choice. But what a neoliberal state does is it acts in the public good operating under the assumption, under the ideological assumption that unfettered economic growth is the most important force for public good. And so a neoliberal state says we want to limit restrictions on companies, on capital, as much as we possibly can. So no minimum wages, no regulations, no monitoring to make sure they're complying with, not having rats taking a dump in the food. The logic is that the market will sort that out. If a company makes hamburgers with rat poop in them, nobody's going to eat them, and that company's going to go out of business, right? And so what happens when you have a neoliberal government is you have or a neoliberal state is you have one that doesn't believe that it's important to protect the natural environment, to protect workers, to protect consumers, to offer a leg up to disadvantaged groups in our society. And you have a government that believes that basically all taxes are a form of theft, and that the government should be collecting as little tax as possible and should be doing as little as possible, that the government should just get out of the way. That is a neoliberal state. That's the state we live in now. Back in the 1930s, we lived in a very different state. Our government in the 1930s was a big welfare state. It believed that the best way to promote the public good was to have lots and lots of social programs that acted on behalf of the public and that favored, in particular, the most vulnerable, the poorest, the most marginalized people in our societies, because they didn't have other ways to go about getting things. Middle-class folks could pay for private schools. Middle-class folks could pay for good private doctors. Middle-class folks could, buy safe food. And so the welfare state sought to protect the most vulnerable, and it did so by rolling out elaborate social support programs. And so it was during this time that Medicare was devised. It was during this time that Medicaid was devised. It was during this time that Social Security was built up and put on the table. It was during this time that, as we talked about, the Federal Housing Authority was built up and put on this table. In the 1970s, we had the big boom of environmental regulation. We created the Environmental Protection Agency. We passed the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, these things that were designed to say to companies, hey, companies, you're good, it's cool, like we like our, whatever the thing is that you make, our rubber tires and cardboard boxes and computer chips and bars of soap and stuff. We like all that, but even if it's more expensive for you to do it, we're going to require you to do it in such a way that you aren't putting a whole bunch of pollutants into the air, you're not dumping a whole bunch of untreated toxic waste into the rivers, and you're paying people a living wage. And so I hope that distinction makes sense. And so if you watch, for example, if you watched this year with me the presidential the debates between the different candidates for the Democratic nomination for president. So debates between, all those Democratic candidates, your Buttigieg and your Warren and Harris and Biden and Sanders and Klobuchar and so on and so forth. Where was I going with this? Something to do with the welfare state. Well, anyway, you probably heard a lot of this same rhetoric, and so the welfare state has, over the 20th century and beyond, been eroded. It's been rolled back. So we have today shittier public things than we have ever had before, with the possible exception of the military. Our military is pretty badass, but everything else that is public about our country sucks. I mean, it's really shitty. I'm sorry to say this. It sucks. It sucks a giant, massive mountain of asses. It's a terrible, shitty, ass-sucking, horrible thing. Our schools, our public schools. Wait a minute. I work at one, and you all study at one. I shouldn't have said it like that. ISU is wonderful. ISU is great. But we're special. We really are. But public schools, and I mean mostly not public universities, but public elementary school, middle school, and high schools, they're not as good today as they were 20 and 50 years ago. They're really not. Our teachers make less money. Our older buildings, sick buildings, crowded classrooms, it's just not as good as it used to be. We don't spend enough on public education. Our infrastructure isn't as good as it used to be. Our public infrastructure, our bridges, our highways, our sidewalks, our sewers, they're not very good. They're falling apart. They used to be good. We used to have a welfare state that taxed a lot, rich people more, but it taxed poor people too, and middle income people, and it spent that money on public things that served everybody. Sewers, everybody poops. Public schools, stuff. Social Security, take care of our old people, take care of our retired workers. All the public stuff is not as good as it used to be because we have eroded our welfare state. We've moved from a welfare state to a neoliberal state, okay? So if you can afford private shit, you're fine. But most of us can't. 50% of us have the same wealth as 1% of us. So all of these things, this was I spent a long ass time on this slide, but I kind of killed it, I'm kind of good. I'm feeling myself right now. All of these things lead to this disconnection, this isolation, this enemy, this antisocialness on our part. And all of this isolation, this disconnection, this deterioration of the social capital creates, it sows the seeds for when a crisis hits, we cannot handle it, okay? When a crisis hits, we are not resilient anymore. We can't bounce back. When a hurricane bombards a major U.S. city, we can't bounce back like that anymore. When a global pandemic takes a big steaming dump on our entire world, we can't bounce back like that anymore. South Korea bounced back. USA, we're not resilient like that right now. We have a weak government, and I don't mean Donald Trump. We've had a weak government for 30 years. longer. So all of this, according to Klinenberg, has to do with or not all of it, doesn't all have to do with social infrastructure, but his idea is that social infrastructure is very important. So what the hell is social infrastructure? Well, he calls it the physical conditions that determine whether social capital develops. So he's not talking about social capital, he's talking about the stuff that allows for social capital to be created. The physical conditions that allow for the creation of social capital. So here's a long ass list of examples of things that count as social infrastructure that produce social capital. Libraries, schools, parks, athletic fields, playgrounds, swimming pools, sidewalks, courtyards, community gardens, green spaces. Why am I reading all of these out loud? You are all literate. Meeting halls with 2 commas for some reason. Farmers markets, stores, aka what he calls third spaces, and bars and cafes are examples of third spaces. So let's talk about third spaces real quick, because that's the only one on this list that isn't public. Maybe community gardens also, but everything else is public, meaning it's developed and run and maintained by the government on some level. But third places or third spaces, so your first space is your home. Home is where the heart is. Your second space is work. You go from home to work, but your third space is the place where you're neither at home nor at work, but you're doing something else that's building that social capital. So if you like to hang out in a bar in the evenings, go to happy hour with your work buddies, that's a third space, right? It's a commercial space, but you're building social capital. It's acting as a public space. If you like to go to coffee shops and get work done and hang out in coffee shops, that is a third space. It's a private space. It's owned by capital and it's for the generation of profit, but it acts like a public space because people come together there, they interact with one another, and they build that social capital. So he concludes by saying, going back to the heat wave and the sort of Chicago story, the difference between the communities that were resilient and the communities that weren't wasn't a matter of individual choice, right? It wasn't that non-resilient communities, the ones that were harder hit because people were just dicks there and didn't care about anybody around them. It wasn't a function of demographics. It wasn't because they were African American communities or white communities or Latino communities or whatever. It was instead a function of the physical infrastructure of those places. So places that had, something as simple as sidewalks, right? Something as simple as a little park on the corner of the block. Places that had diners, locally owned diners where people would go and shoot the shit. Places that had physical spaces for block club meetings and that sort of thing. Those were the places that were more resilient. People in communities that didn't have those things were caring, fully formed human beings. They weren't sociopaths. But the physical infrastructure wasn't there for those people to come together as a community. So a quote from the first chapter that I think reflects this nicely. In 1995, residents of Auburn Gresham walked to diners, parks, barbershops, and grocery stores. They participated in book clubs and church groups. They knew their neighbors. Not because they made special efforts to meet them, but because they lived in a place where casual interaction was a feature of everyday life. See what I'm saying? Another quotation here, and I'm sorry, apparently my beautiful face is blocking a little bit of the text. You'll forgive me. When the levees break, cities, and this is a quote that I included in particular because it speaks to the kind of subtle subtext theme of this week, which is the global pandemic that we're all like right smack dab in the middle of right now, and it's all that any of us can think about. And so like the heat wave, COVID-19 is stressing the hell out of our systems. It's not stressing our energy system like the heat wave did, but it's stressing our medical system in a major way, right? And so I think this quote speaks to that. So he writes, when the levees break, cities and coastal areas flood, sometimes catastrophically. When the power goes out, most businesses, healthcare providers, and schools cannot operate, and many transit and communications networks stop running too. Breakdowns in the fuel supply can be even more consequential, since oil generates most of our heat and gas powers the trucks that deliver nearly all the food and medications consumed in large cities and suburbs, as well as the automobiles that most depend on to travel. No one needs a lengthy description of the problems that occur when the sewage system stops working. Even Eric Klinenberg makes a poop joke. Feel justified, validated. Uh, but, I believe that was supposed to be but, not button. The real problems come when several or all of these systems collapse simultaneously, as they do during extreme weather events or terrorist attacks, or, if he'd written this 2 years later, global infectious pandemics. When hard infrastructure fails, as it did in the Great Chicago Heat Wave, it's the softer social infrastructure that determines our fate. So those parks, those schools, those meeting places, those sidewalks, those green spaces, barber shops, third spaces, right? These things, the presence of these and the robustness of these make a massive difference in times of great stress on our systems. You can see where I'm going here. We are in a unique situation. People overuse the word unique. Unique means unique. Never before has existed and will never exist again. A one-of-a-kind thing. That's what unique means. This is a unique situation. COVID-19 is unique. We are in the middle of a crisis that, and no shade to the Chicago heat wave or Hurricane Katrina or any of the other horrible, devastating crises that our country or different parts of the world have faced in recent history. But this is a big, widespread crisis. And it's a democratic crisis in many ways. As the bagger at Kroger very astutely said to me the other day, viruses don't know anything about politics. Viruses don't care. But my point is that the paradox of this is what I really want to draw out here. When systems are stressed, when we are facing these radical crises, it's the social infrastructure that makes or breaks the ability of a community to withstand the crisis. So what happens when the crisis literally obligates us, literally forces us to be in our homes, isolated and totally unable to access the public infrastructure, the social infrastructure? This is the great and the unique paradox of our current crisis. At the moment in world history in which we most need each other, when we most need parks and beaches and libraries and cafes and bars, we have none of it. And that's what makes this so unique and part of what makes it so terrifying. So he goes on to tell us that social infrastructure is underappreciated. It's underrecognized. It's not a thing. He talks about 2016, the 2016 election, Trump and Hillary on the debate stage, and one of the very few things on which they agreed was the fact that our public infrastructure is tragically old and decrepit and underfunded. And both of them committed to rebuilding our physical infrastructure. But it hasn't happened yet, but both of them committed on the debate stage to in 2016 to rebuilding our social infrastructure. I'm sorry, not our social infrastructure, our hard infrastructure. Um, but the social infrastructure is something that nobody, at least on the policymaker level, has recognized as salient and important. And that makes it all the more important, says Klinenberg, to focus on it. One more quote. I think this is the last quote, but don't quote me. See what I did there? The components of social infrastructure rarely crash as completely or as visibly as a fallen bridge or a downed electrical line, and their breakdowns don't result in immediate systemic failures, but when the social infrastructure gets degraded, the consequences are unmistakable. People reduce the time they spend in public settings and hunker down in their safe houses. Social networks weaken, crime rises, older and sicker people grow isolated, younger people get addicted to drugs and become more vulnerable to lethal overdoses, distrust rises, and participation wanes. Well, that is a quote that is eerily prescient, having been written and published in 2018, of this particular moment in our history. Our social networks are weak, older and sicker people are isolated. We are all being isolated, and our social infrastructure isn't, we're not able to take advantage of it. We're not able to use it. And so we, as a society, have probably never been more vulnerable than we are now.